We would like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. This webinar comes at a time when all of us are dealing with additional isolation due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to dive into how we can learn to accept what we can't control and what we can, and our response to it. We hope to convey today how to maximize that control over our bodies and how to manage the stress of these times. We'll begin with some questions for our guest, Lynns, and then she will end our webinar today by taking us through a mindfulness guided meditation session.
And I'd like to start by introducing myself. I'm Kathy Olevsky, and I'm the new 2020 educational webinar host. I'm bringing the patient perspective to the webinars this year. Before my diagnosis, I was an athlete. In my professional life, I own several martial arts schools, which my husband, son, and I operate together. I'm an 8th degree black belt in karate and have been teaching martial arts for 40 years. I was in treatment for 6 years, and I've been in remission off treatment for 6 years.
So, Lynn is a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh in 1983 with her master's in social work. Her original training was in family systems therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. She worked with the chronically mentally ill in a partial hospital setting from 1983 to 1986. Her vast experience includes working in a community mental health outpatient therapy department and working with a private psychiatrist. She later worked for the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and last year she opened a solo practice working with clients. So welcome, Lynn. It's great to have you on our webinar today.
Thank you, Kathy. It's nice to be here. It's an honor to be present during this really difficult time.
Well, we certainly appreciate your help because there's so many things that we're dealing with. This is an extraordinary experience that most of us have never gone through. Can you talk a little bit about what you're observing, hearing, and experiencing in terms of how this crisis is impacting our coping methods?
Yes, I really do see all crisis as a huge opportunity for us to grow. You know, we all have been pushed outside our comfort zone through this crisis in many obvious ways by, being forced to shelter in place in our homes, being disconnected from our friends and sometimes our loved ones, being inundated with information that can be very difficult to process and often overwhelming. So I would say as a collective, as an American collective and a global collective, we're all experiencing heightened anxiety. And I think that is most likely much exacerbated by being a patient who is highly vulnerable at this time. So there's anxiety that is heightened everywhere, and that is amplified with more vulnerable populations.
Yes, that's in a capsule. That is what we're all experiencing.
So I understand that you have you are also a patient who is an autoimmune compromised patient and has vasculitis as well. Can you say a little bit about how that has impacted you personally and the way you are managing the stress?
Sure. I am a patient with ANCA vasculitis, and it's funny, I've heard some patients say, we're good at isolation because all of us have to be super careful when we're under treatment. But this goes beyond that. And I do feel like I learned from my treatment. I've been in remission for 6 years off treatment, so I'm pretty much back to a normal life. But I do have chronic kidney disease because it weakens my kidneys to a point that they're functional but not great. And so I do have to be careful. I'm also one of those older people, so I do have to be careful. And I do think I have learned to cope with things through having ANCA vasculitis and going through all of the isolation that I had when I was taking care of myself. But also, it's true, my martial arts background did help me a lot with, there's always something in front of you that's going to be difficult to overcome, and you just put one foot forward and move towards it. And if you spend all your time thinking about what could go wrong, as they say, it's never what you think could go wrong that will get you. It's all the other things. So I don't focus on those things. I focus on moving forward, and everything is a step, and every step gets me closer to my goal, whatever my goal is. In this case, my goal is to stay at home and stay healthy until they say, okay, everybody, you can go back to work and go out about your day. So I do think it helped me a bit, but I think everybody is drawing from some experience, and I still think we're all having a little bit of panic type stress that we've never experienced before, because nobody could have ever predicted that this would happen to us. And one of the hardest things for everyone, but especially patients with an autoimmune condition, is trying to deal with what's out of our control and what's within our control, and the response to this kind of health crisis, you know? And in these situations, the patient can feel totally helpless or, you know, at the mercy of the virus. And in fact, we need to recognize what we have control over, and the things that we can do to regain some sense of power. Do you think you could talk a little bit about that, why it's important to identify and understand the differences in how we respond, and, you know, especially how to leverage and build on those things that we can control?
Yes, and I guess I'd like to start by piggybacking off what you shared about your own experience, that you had come to see that it's not the things we imagine that could go wrong that get us, it's other things we couldn't have imagined. And I'm going to imagine right now that when you get a diagnosis of vasculitis, that is a same kind of experience, that you could never have imagined it, and all of a sudden you have this diagnosis. So one thing I would like to point out is that I am imagining that many, many vasculitis patients have already had this experience of feeling so blindsided by life and having found a way to get through what feels unmanageable or very overwhelming. And probably at some point in the process, there's fear and doubt that I can do this. But finding a way to do it, as you said, one day at a time, one step at a time. So I think what you alluded to, these fears of what could go wrong, that's absolutely what we're all being confronted with right now, and it's pervading our media and our conversations, because it is so shocking and nothing we could ever have imagined. One of the ways the ego in the mind tries to handle that is to imagine what will go wrong and try to be prepared for it. But what I have found over and over again, that is a limited skill. It's a skill to some degree. And one of the great challenges is to discern how useful is planning. Some planning is very useful, and some strategy is very useful. And that, for example, the sheltering in place, the hand washing that we are all doing, the truly limiting our exposures, and being very vigilant about how we choose to clean ourselves and avoid exposures to the best of our ability. But the imagining that we can all get caught up in about what could go wrong actually takes our nervous system down this river of fear. And, you know, that's my metaphor for it, that what really happens is our sympathetic nervous system becomes overwhelmed and hyperstimulated, and that is the part of our nervous system that is there for our survival. So it's a very incredibly wonderful protective mechanism, but it is now highly overactivated. It was honestly meant for situations where we have to run away. It's the fight, flight, freeze response. And those responses are oriented to survival, but in situations of chronic stress or overwhelming fear, they can be overactivated. So one of the most important things we can do is recognize when our nervous system is being overactivated, when maybe we're exposing ourselves to too much media, or our imagination is running away down that river of fear, and gently find a way to validate our feelings, because the fear is real. And I don't in any way want to dismiss that. I think that this is a really challenging way to balance. The challenge for all of us is to balance honoring our fear, expressing our fear, making sure we're not expanding it through imaginary thinking, and then coming back to the present moment in a way where we can calm our nervous systems and find what else is true. Because no matter how frightened we are or how scary the situation may be, there is always something else that we can take comfort in or find a way to support ourselves in getting through that fear. So I think that's the delicate balance of taking the action. So when we're in fight, flight, or freeze, we can easily feel powerless or helpless and flooded with fear and anxiety. And that's what everyone is experiencing now in some ways, some of us more than others. And that needs to be honored. But one way out of those feelings of helplessness is positive action. And the action can be many, many things for different people. It could be as simple as doing a breathing practice, building a puzzle, preparing a meal, finding a way to help somebody that might be in need. Could be a neighbor that's very elderly or isolated and doesn't have a way to get to a grocery store. I mean, there are many things we can do. Sometimes it's as simple as sending a little note, a text, a phone call, contacting through social media. There are many things each of us can do that will take us out of those feelings of helplessness and powerlessness. And I think the challenge is to have the conversations which honor our fear, and then also have those conversations with ourselves and with our loved ones about what we can do to come back to the present moment in some way that honors what is and also acknowledges what else is true. So I like to say that our nervous systems are often in this continuum of either fear or love on some basic level. At any moment, our thoughts, behaviors, actions, choices, we could narrow them. The common denominator is we are either in fear or we are in some form of love. And you could include peace and gratitude and compassion and kindness and patience on the continuum of love. And on the continuum of fear, I'm talking about everything from worry and anxiety, irritability, obsessive thinking. We all know this because it's the nature of being a human being to experience both. But when we are in that fear, and it's flooding us, the best way out of it is to honor it, meet it with compassion, and ask ourselves, what else is true? How can I come back to some other awareness of kindness, compassion, gratitude, action, those kinds of things.
Wow. I mean, just what you said was so helpful to me. I was just thinking while you were talking about how true that is, that you can live in the fear or you can replace it with something. And I realized that I do that, and that I called to check on my dad and my husband's father because they're older. I helped my father and my stepmom learn how to order groceries instead of going to the grocery store. And in those moments when I was doing that, I was away from the fear that I was living in. You know, one of the biggest challenges as a patient is the need to stay informed and get the latest updates for our own health. You know, it's so twofold. I need the information, but the information scares me. So too much information, some of which is probably inaccurate, can be one of the most paralyzing and stressful triggers. I know you did suggest, some things for that. Maybe you have more suggestions on filtering, auditing, and controlling the stream of information that's coming at us right now. Some of it's good information, but some of it's not.
Absolutely. I think that's a really critical issue, and I have to say that I think as a culture, we've all been facing this challenge even before the coronavirus pandemic. in terms of just the amount of information we are all asked to process on a given day, we are often overloaded mentally. And I think it's a huge cause of anxiety and fatigue and depression and burnout. So this coronavirus set of information is just amplifying. And I think most of us have had nervous systems that are pretty overloaded and taxed. And I really encourage everyone to try to start noticing their own bodies, their own minds, their own nervous systems, and I think of that as mind, body, heart, spirit, all the whole aspects of our being, to become very observant and respectful, and to become really wise observers of how our nervous systems process information and our experiences. So what I have personally done is really intentionally limit my visual news stream when it comes to this pandemic, because I am a very empathic, sensitive person, and I find that some of the images of scenes in hospitals and patients and families is much more emotionally impactful for me, and I limit how I expose myself to that. I have started trying to consume news that is more printed. And again, I don't know, but I think the Vasculitis Foundation also is a good source of information about what will impact patients. So my biggest advice is to really consciously limit. I think when we're all home and it's so easy to be connected to electronics, and we do need to stay connected interpersonally through social media, it's even more challenging to turn off the television or turn off the computer monitor. But I think it's even more important to give our nervous systems a break from the disturbing information, the overloading information, and as you said, the information that may not be accurate. Because we have so many news stations that, maintain 24/7 viewership, it's just the nature of visual media to somewhat anticipate and negatively imagine, and that is the last thing we need to be doing as individuals.
That makes so much sense. I mean, I think that we're all, as autoimmune suppressed patients, we're all very scared. And I think now we've been taught what this virus is, how it initiates, and we all at this point know we should contact our doctor when we have questions about are we contracting, have we contracted this, or is this just something else, and maybe spend less time focusing on what the media is giving us and spend more time, like you said, get the proper information, and then replace some of this stimulation that we're getting from the media with what you suggested, which are things that make you feel great and comfortable and kind and loved. And I think those are all great ideas. Most of the time, we understandably focus on the patient when we talk about these things, but I feel like we also need to address the impact of the folks who support the patients. It's especially true for pediatric or young adult patients. It's a stressful time for both the caregivers and the patients. The patients need to recognize and understand the stress it's having on their spouse or parents and take that into consideration. At the same time, the caregivers need to especially understand the stress and anxiety on the patients. We need to be taking their fears seriously and not dismissing them as being like overly concerned. And we hear from patients who are upset because their families don't recognize the importance of following the social distance guidelines to help and protect their health. Can you talk about how stress can affect everyone, especially when we're all physically cooped up in a tight environment? It's not just the patient, it's the patient and the caregivers, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think caregiving is a very challenging role and very different depending on the nature of that relationship, whether it's a parent-child relationship, especially a parent with a young child, That's a very different dynamic than, a spousal relationship or a friend relationship or a parent with an adult child, but they all have very unique challenges, and both the patient and the caregiver are impacted in ways that I think are difficult for each person. And there is always a challenge to determine who is responsible for what in caretaking relationships. I think that is true in every relationship, but it's amplified in relationships where there is a patient-caregiver dynamic. So both ends of that spectrum have unique challenges. And I would say the healing in both of those places is similar in that the more both the patient and the caretaker can work on managing their own anxiety and finding ways to come to their own calm center, that is the place they will be able to be most discerning from in terms of how should I intervene in this moment? How should I communicate with my loved one? So it is really important for both the caregiver and the patient to manage their own anxiety. And I think as a caregiver, it's very easy to dismiss your own feelings and only see the feelings of the patient or the other way around. So the other piece of this is to do your best, as in any relationship, to have compassion for the unique challenges of the other. Now, if we're talking about a very young child, that child will be very limited in how much compassion they can have for the parent. And the parent will have a lot more burden and responsibility in terms of how to discern where do I step in, what is my responsibility, where am I operating from a place of love versus fear.
Wow, that so much of that is so helpful to me. It's interesting just to hear the perspective of, everybody take ownership of your own situation and work on your own self, and that will help both of you. Such a thought that I've never had before. So, Lynn, I have another question. People are seriously feeling these stresses, and some of them they've already gotten out of control, and maybe it would be appropriate for them to seek some therapy, but they're in isolation in their homes. I've heard about teletherapy, and I'm sure it's more prevalent right now. Can you advise people on teletherapy being a valid form of dealing with some of their stress?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, my practice out of my home right now is completely teletherapy because of the virus and the risks of, social proximity. We're all maintaining social distance, but one of the blessings in this internet era is that we can remain connected. So I believe that social support is a critical way to avoid getting lost in fear, and our nervous systems are immediately calmed when we feel connection to a caring other. So whether that's a family member, a friend, or a professional therapist, I really encourage everyone to make sure they are connecting to a caring other. Teletherapy is now being completely supported by insurance companies. Most, if not all the insurance companies I currently work with are waiving copays and deductibles and solely supporting teletherapy. And there are technologies in place which completely protect people's confidentiality and make it so accessible. So I've been maintaining connection with my clients through FaceTime or voice calls, whichever they prefer. And I have found it just one added surprise, but a good one through this difficult time. So this could be an opportunity for anyone who feels a need for additional support to really find a therapist and know that teletherapy is something that you don't have to come out of your home and risk exposure. You can totally speak by phone. So I will say that I think in the midst of every crisis of any kind, not just this one, there's always a huge opportunity for growth and learning. And one of my hopes is that we all become more skilled at managing our anxiety as we go through this crisis. And there are other potential gifts as well, such as we all learn how to slow down We all may learn how to limit information overload. We all may find much more gratitude for the simple things in life, and especially our loved ones. So I do think that there are going to be many lessons in this, and one other of that is maybe we'll all become more skilled in meditation and guided relaxation. And this is something I am going to guide a meditation that after listening for a while, you can actually learn to do your own version of it. It's going to be a body scan that uses breathing and cultivates an observing, wise mind. And I think that is one of the best ways to manage anxiety, when we all strengthen our ability to observe our experience and meet our experience with non-judgment and kindness and gentleness, and taking the time to even become aware of it. So that all requires slowing down.